This is the Cycling Over 60 podcast, Season 2, Episode 34, Behavior Change for Good, and I'm your host, Tom Butler. Thanks for joining me for another look at my journey to use cycling to get and stay fit. I did my first episode on March 19th of last year, so the podcast hit a year old this week. That's exciting. I am currently listening to a book by Richard Johnson, a kidney doctor and professor. The title is Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. I am truly enjoying the book. The main premise is that we have a survival switch in our bodies that when flipped, we are driven to accumulate fat. And the biggest switch flipper is fructose. So this information is adding to my commitment to avoid fructose as much as possible. I am also even more concerned about my fat stores. There is just so much evidence that I will need to learn to stay lean for the rest of my life. With this in mind, I took advantage of the absolutely gorgeous weather we had and did a 50-mile ride in a way that I hope to burn as much fat as possible. What I mean by that is that I did the ride at a very low intensity. I think it was a really good idea, and I will do it again. I don't have any way of measuring if I actually did burn fat, but I would estimate that I burned 3,000 calories during the ride, and I was definitely doing a low enough intensity that my body could be in fat-burning mode. I ended up with 120 miles over the 4 warm days we had, so that dropped the amount of miles I am behind my annual goal to under 100. Last week I mentioned I would start planning out the days of the 400-mile ride I would like to do this season across Washington. Obviously, the first thing to look at is the start. I've been talking about riding across Washington State, but U.S. Bike Route 10 doesn't technically start on the western side of Washington. The ride starts in Anacortes, Washington, which is on Rosario Strait. It would take a boat ride through the Strait of Juan de Fuca to get to the Pacific Ocean. If I wanted to actually ride from the Pacific coast to Idaho, I would have to add 169 miles, 6,302 feet of climbing, and a ferry ride to the trip. Modifying the route that way would be a spectacular trip, but beyond what I'm looking to do this season. Therefore, I am planning on starting in Anacortes. The first day of the trip would be going through some farm country and getting to the start of climbing over the Cascades. One potential stop for the first day would be New Halem, Washington. That would make the first day 83 miles with 1,800 feet of climbing. Instead, I could go on to Diablo, but that would take the first day to 118 miles and 2,457 feet of climbing. I don't think I want to push it that much the first day. So for now, I will plan on stopping in New Halem, where I think there is a better place to stay. The North Cascades Highway is gorgeous for sure, but what makes it beautiful also makes it a bit of a challenge for me. First, it goes over the Cascade Mountain Range, which has forest, waterfalls, and amazing mountain views. The price I will pay for those views is the climbing on day 2. The other thing that makes it beautiful is how remote it is. You are surrounded by national park land. There aren't many stops for food or water. So that means I will have to carry more than I'm used to carrying. And a bike problem would mean waiting a long time to get a repair done. I think that makes it important that I talk to someone who has rode this route before and find out all I need to know. Staying in New Halem means the second day starts with 42 miles and climbing of 6,923 feet. After that, it is downhill for a long time. I have a decision to make for the end of the day. I could choose to stop in a very intriguing town, Winthrop, Washington. That would only give me another 32 miles, so I would end up with 74 miles on the day. I might need that after what would be over 7,000 feet of climbing in one day. And I would love to spend some time in Winthrop. The problem is that I would only be at 151 miles after 2 days of riding. I was hoping for close to 100 miles a day. Another option is to end the second day in Okanagan. That would put me at 109 miles for the day. It would also mean over 10,000 feet of climbing. Right now, that seems like it would be too much for me. For now, I guess I will work on the other days of the route and see if I can make it work to stop in Winthrop on day 2. I am really happy about what I have been able to accomplish towards my health goals over the last year, but it hasn't been entirely smooth, and I am continually struggling to keep moving forward. So I wanted to better understand what has been successful over the last year and use that knowledge to make my future efforts pay off. I'm really excited that I was able to get connected to Sean Ellis, Ph.D., at the Behavioral Change for Good initiative at the University of Pennsylvania. They're doing some fantastic work there to uncover the secrets for making lasting change. Here's our discussion. I love it when I find a perfect guest to come on the podcast to talk about a topic, and I feel that way about Dr. Sean Ellis, who is joining me now. Thanks, Dr. Ellis, for taking the time to be here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So I'll start out with a question that I like to ask people. Do you have any memories of bikes as a kid?
I do. Riding my bike growing up was probably one of my favorite activities. I lived in a cul-de-sac with a bunch of other kids my age, so there's a whole group of us that would roam around the neighborhood.
I think that's always fun to see a pack of kids on bikes. Mm-hmm. You know that they're off adventuring or having fun for sure. Now, you have a PhD in economics and an MS in economics and applied econometrics. You're currently the director of analytics at the Behavior Change for Good initiative at University of Pennsylvania. Can you talk about the Behavior Change for Good initiative and your role there?
So BCFG is a research initiative co-led by professors Katie Milkman and Angela Duckworth. And we focus on what we call mega studies, or large-scale field studies that contain many smaller sub-studies, which we all run simultaneously aimed at changing the same objective behavior. And mega studies allow us to, A/B test multiple behavioral science strategies at once, testing some of the best ideas from our scientific team, which is composed of a little over 170 of the world's leading behavioral scientists. And doing this allows us to identify which strategies work best overall to change behavior for good and for whom. And my role at BCFG is to oversee pretty much all the analytics involved in kind of that process. So whether it's determining, kind of setting up the experiment in the beginning and determining, what kind of analyses are we going to conduct once it's over, and then to actually analyzing all the data after an experiment has run, and then seeing that all the way to publication. One of my favorite things about working at Penn and at BCFG specifically is I get to work with just brilliant people, and we're all doing really, really cool research.
Can you explain the term behavioral economics?
So behavioral economics is, kind of a combination between psychology and economics, and it's the study of decision-making and understanding human behavior. Specifically, why do people, do the things that they do? And behavioral economics kind of differs from neoclassical economics because we don't just assume people are rational and will always make self-interested decisions. We're interested in large part about why people don't act what you would think would be rationally or in their best interest. And so behavioral economics is really based on the observations we make of human behavior and trying to understand and change it for the better.
I think a lot of people associate economics with money. I think that there's, this element of the decision making that is really at the heart of all economics that many times people don't think about.
No, absolutely. The amount of times people will ask what I do, the short answer is I'm an economist. And then they ask, what stocks should I buy? And I'm like, I have no idea. But that's really a public misconception about economics, because economics really is just the study of both decision-making as well as the allocation of resources.
You mentioned mega studies. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the value of mega studies.
So mega studies kind of arose out of a desire to kind of address, some major issues in the social sciences, specifically, policy. When, politicians or stakeholders or policymakers are designing it, should ideally be based on evidence. And that evidence, again, ideally would come from the field. However, conducting field studies and research is very time consuming. It's also very expensive. And it can be really difficult at times when you're looking at, even several really well done studies. If they're not, studying the same exact behavior, it can be difficult to kind of compare the results because you're making an apples to oranges, or sometimes an apples to Volkswagens kind of comparison. And so policymakers are left wondering, well, which is better? What should we do? And then, another issue which has been happening, in the social sciences in general, but especially in the fields of psychology and economics, is the replication crisis. A lot of research has been found not to replicate, and typically because when the research was run, standards in the field were different. And so people were looking at results from studies that only had 50, 75, a few hundred participants in the studies. And then when you scale that up to tens of thousands or millions of people, the results just don't hold. And so mega studies were born out of this desire to address both of these issues. Conducting a mega study allows researchers to keep down fixed costs of executing a study because they're only, borne by a single central organizer. It reduces the risk of learning nothing from field studies because we're testing multiple ideas at once. We're probably going to find something that works or be really confident that maybe nothing will work. And that way we don't end up with what's known as the file drawer problem, which is, historically and still very much is the case. If you want to get your research published, it's very difficult to do that if your results are null or you found that things didn't work. And so researchers typically, if they can't find, they don't have, results. If they don't have something where they can say, this worked, this is a solution, they'll, not publish the results or not be able to publish the results. And then, of course, no one else in the world knows that. And then other researchers might spend time and money researching the exact same thing, also find it doesn't work. And then again, they're not publishing. And so, we're not being as efficient as we can. Mega studies also allow us to kind of bring in not just, behavioral scientists and economists and psychologists, but really, researchers and experts from, a diverse array of fields so that we create these interdisciplinary teams where we're pulling on, the knowledge from different fields of study. They also allow us to do what we call behavioral phenotyping. We're figuring out what works for whom, right? Are there differences with, how a intervention works between different types of groups, such as gender, race, socioeconomic status? And mega studies also vastly accelerate the pace of scientific discovery. The traditional study, you'll maybe look at, 1 to 3 or 4 ideas max, and then you'll kind of run that, and then you'll start your next study after that, and then the next one after that. And you just make this slow incremental progress. But mega studies allow us to, kind of leapfrog scientific progress by testing all these ideas at once.
From the analytic side of things, it seems like there's a lot of tools that you must use when you're doing analysis of a mega study.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about kind of breaking down and being able to separate out maybe what works for one group of people, then to be able to really do an analysis of all those different data sets must be a bit complicated.
Can be. One of the benefits of running experiments as opposed to downloading a data set that was already put together by, say, a government agency is that as experimentalists, we can design what type of data we actually collect and how we collect it. So that can, to a degree, simplify the analyses we have to do because we understand, the data generating process. However, in order to, run these studies, we have to make sure that whoever we're partnering with, that we actually can collect the data and that the data is some objective outcome that we're able to manipulate with our interventions. And we also need to make sure before we run a study, and this is probably one of the biggest difficulties of conducting mega studies, is do we have enough of a sample size? Because in order to be able to tell what works for who, well, we have to have enough people in all those different subgroups, which is why we do a lot of analyses before we even run a study to determine, do we have the power to actually draw conclusions? for the things that we want to draw conclusions about.
I think it's right to say that BCFG is interested in affecting change for populations, for
Correct.
larger groups of people. And so that to me means policy change.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you could give an example of how behavioral economics research can inform policy decisions.
No, absolutely. So in 2010, the kind of first nudge unit was opened in the UK government. And so it was a group of behavioral scientists whose whole job is to look at what are we currently doing from a public policy perspective, and are there, zero cost or low cost ways that we can change how we're implementing policies to achieve some desired effect, whether that's, and then that kind of idea then spread all around the globe. And so now there are nudge units in, most developed countries, governments, and not just, in kind of the top of the government, but like throughout the government. Here in the United States, one of the things that has proven really successful is, you want to get people who are on Medicare, Medicaid, veterans to enroll in certain programs or go in and get certain health checks. And we found a lot of really simple ways to do that. And, that is from reducing what is now being called sludge, or, the red tape or the complicated or overly burdensome process of trying to, get some benefit or go in and set up an appointment, to simple reminders or how you frame reminders to motivate people to engage in whatever the desired behavior is.
Well, I'm really looking forward. I think there's a lot of work that you do that no one sees.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's awesome to think about what you guys are doing and hopefully see some of it from time to time. I spoke with a neurologist, Dr. Patrick Hogan, a while ago. I asked him about patient compliance, and he, like many doctors, knows that people frequently don't choose healthy habits despite being fully aware of the consequences. What are your thoughts about this dynamic?
It's a major problem. And here at BCFG, we kind of focus on three main topics: education, savings, and then healthcare. And this is one of the biggest issues in healthcare. Is there are many ways that we could improve human health. It's just we're having a hard time getting people to actually do it, which there's a couple of factors at play. One of them is, the availability bias. Your doctor tells you you should, start doing something or stop doing something, but you think to yourself, well, everyone in my life is doing this, or everyone I know does this, but, I don't do it as, my habits aren't as bad as theirs. And so, nothing bad is really going to happen to me because nothing bad has happened to them. There's also, a status quo issue, which is people tend not to deviate from whatever their default option or existing habits are. And getting them to change is very difficult, which is why getting people into, healthier and better habits earlier on is really key to preventing a lot of issues, a lot of healthcare issues that people have. There's also, kind of the issue of hyperbolic discounting, or that people, when thinking in the abstract or thinking far off into the future, people are like, you know what, I really do need to, start eating healthier or quit smoking because I need to get my blood pressure under control, or, something like that. But as you actually get to the point where you want to engage in that unhealthy behavior, right? You really want to smoke, or you really want that steak. You're like, well, the temptation is too much in that moment. And then people engage in that behavior, but then they just keep thinking, in the future, I'll be better. In the future, I'll have more restraint, or I'll be more patient. And then that kind of cycle or lack of inertia just continues.
So, the issue of staying fit later in life is a big one. The current recommendation is that adults need 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity and 2 days of muscle strengthening activity each week, which doesn't seem insurmountable. However, the majority of people aren't getting that. Quality of life is affected, but there's also an economic impact. You mentioned that healthcare is one of the focus areas that you have. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that aspect of the impact that would happen if there was a shift in the amount of activity people get.
There would be definitely a positive economic impact on the individual level. As Americans age and we're aging, we're living longer than ever before. But people aren't necessarily, they may be living longer, but they're not necessarily living, to a better quality lifestyle as they get older. And so there's a lot of healthcare costs, both to, people, private health insurance plans, but also to Medicare and Medicaid that then, that money has to get recouped after someone passes away. And so that can take a lot of, wealth out of someone's estate. And it can also, reduce the quality of life. And so people who might want to either keep working because they really enjoy it, can't, or people who retire and then want to go to be active and travel, or maybe finally start that crazy business idea that they had, aren't able to because they're just physically not up to it. And so there's all that unrealized economic activity. In addition to then all this money that is being spent to care for people as they get older, which is only increasing right now because of the size of the baby boomer generation. And then, the millennial generation, America's largest generation after that.
I wanted you to come on and help analyze the success that I've had. It seems kind of the polar opposite of a mega study, like talking about one person, and my efforts certainly have paid off. I've gotten more healthy. It hasn't been the case in the past when I've tried to do things, and I'm certainly not perfect now. It seems like there are so many complicating factors that contribute to successful change. Do you agree with that? It's a really complicated process.
It absolutely is. And most people, whenever they're trying to, change some behavior, whether it's, especially if it's in the realm of, exercising more, there's lots of failed attempts before a successful attempt. Because, just getting, breaking out of the kind of pattern that you're currently in can be extremely difficult. And then once you get going, there's so many obstacles that pop up in your way that can easily derail you, especially in the beginning.
You mentioned inertia, and I felt that. It seems like that when I make a decision to try to reverse some lifestyle related disease, it seems like there's this like block to making change. I'm wondering if you could go into a little more detail about how you see inertia as far as the choices that we make.
So people will continue to do, it's kind of like what is that? Newton's first law of physics. An object in motion will stay in motion unless it hits an object of, equal or greater force. And then that could, change it. That's how people in their habits are. People continue kind of down a path, even when there's a desire to change. And it really is trying to figure out a way to break out of that, which, there can be, first, obviously, you need a desire to change a certain behavior in order to do it. But then once you have that desire, you need something that really, puts you in, a different direction, that gets you moving and gets you moving with like a force that allows you to keep going and making progress, which, one of the kind of really big effects that have been found is known as the fresh start effect. So when someone feels like they're creating a fresh start, whether it's at, the beginning of the year, so New Year's, or their birthday, or some other significant date, it can feel like, well, now things are new, right? You're becoming disconnected from kind of the past and your past habits and, maybe poor decision making, and you're now on a different course. And that kind of psychological framing in the mind can give people the needed, push to start to make change.
It's interesting you talk about this fresh start, because when I made a decision that I got to make some changes here. Otherwise, I could have some really bad effects, like having to be on dialysis or whatever.
Right.
And so I'm like, okay, I need to make a change. And I went out and bought a new bike. And looking back, it seems like that was a turning point. It seems like that was, a kind of a fresh start.
Absolutely. I would also say, it's not just a fresh start because you got a new bike, but it's also a commitment device. if you bought that bike and then you just kind of let it sit around the house and not use it, well, bikes aren't cheap. I'm currently have been looking to purchase a bike myself, and it's a significant financial investment. And so you're committing, a good chunk of money that you could spend on literally anything else into this new habit. And so if you didn't, start cycling when you bought that new bike, you could also be feeling a sense of loss aversion, right? For whatever else you could have done with that money.
I think it's a good point. And in addition to what I'd be feeling, there would be this personal feeling like, man, I just wasted money going out and doing this. But then there's also my wife, who's like,
Hmm.
well, are you going to use that? I don't remember her asking that question, but I it might have been in her mind that, okay, you're going to buy this bike, but are you going to use it? So that, there is that element there. Now, there's another aspect of it in, we could get sidetracked for the rest of the time here, just talking about you choosing to buy a new bike. That would
Right.
be that'd be easy for me to do because I enjoy cycling, and jumping on a bike and hitting a trail. It's something that is really great for me, and there's a lot of intrinsic value there. I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about how important it is, that kind of enjoyment as far as making lasting change.
It can be a key factor. It definitely makes it a lot easier to affect behavior change if the behavior you're trying to adopt is something you actually enjoy. Because if you don't enjoy it, right, and a lot of people have that problem when it comes to working out or getting active, is they start doing activities that they just don't like, right? And so then there's that initial excitement or drive to maybe, change your behavior, become healthier, but then that wears off relatively quickly. And then if you're not actually enjoying what you're doing, there's, like a really big barrier to keep going. Because most people, when you're not happy, you're like, well, let me stop doing the thing that doesn't make me happy. However, not enjoying an activity isn't necessarily a deal breaker for adopting it. There's a concept known as temptation bundling. So if someone doesn't like going to the gym and working out because they just, they're tired, they're sweaty, it's just not their kind of cup of tea, but it's something they know they need to do for their health, they can essentially pair this undesirable activity that's good for them with an activity they actually do enjoy, such as, watching their favorite show. And so when they're on the treadmill, they're running or walking, whatever it is they're doing, but then they're also watching on their phone or tablet the show that they like. And so they then only allow themselves to enjoy this activity when they're also doing this other activity that they don't enjoy but know they need to do.
I can really see the application of that in a lot of ways. I saw some early success, and I think that kept me going, having that initial kind of, hey, maybe for me, it was like, hey, maybe I'm not done cycling at 59 years old, the time. And then I set what for me was a big goal, something that I wasn't even sure I was going to be able to accomplish, but I really wanted to accomplish it. And that was to do the Seattle to Portland ride, 200 miles, if you're not familiar with it. And so having that goal seemed to be particularly important to me. What have you learned about setting goals?
Goal setting is extremely important, especially if what you're trying to do is something that's difficult, right? It's very easy to continue a behavior that you enjoy and is really easy, but it can be hard to continue with something that even if you enjoy it is, hard, which cycling, especially as you're increasing distance, gets more and more difficult, taxing on the body. It's time consuming. And so setting a goal gives you something to work towards and look forward to and kind of justify in your mind, especially when the going gets hard, that there's a reason I'm doing this and there's a reason not to stop. But what's important isn't just to set a big overarching goal, but to set small, easily achievable goals along the way. Because if you only set a big goal of, doing a 200-mile bike ride, and then you're just kind of starting out, in those first few weeks, you could be like, you know what, right? You said you were 59. You could have easily been like, you know what, I'm 59. I could have done this years ago. I missed my chance. I'm done, right? But if you set smaller goals of, you know what, I'm not riding 200 miles today. I'm going to ride a mile. I'm going to ride 5 miles. I'm going to do 10 miles. You know, you can start to see progress and you feel like you're actually making progress and not just kind of, running in place, which can be really frustrating at times when you set kind of a large goal that seems very far off.
That's a good point. My birthday was in February, which was plenty of time before the summer ride of the STP. And I did 60 miles on my 60th birthday. And
Nice.
yeah, and again, it was one of those things like, okay, that showed me that I'm capable of doing something, and that, that wasn't 200 miles, but it was certainly a step in the right direction, and the longest I had ridden in a very long time. I decided to start the podcast out of an interest to share information with others. However, looking back, it was probably the best thing I could do because it was a major accountability mechanism. What do you think about the setting up that kind of element of accountability?
Again, it's another great behavioral strategy is to make your actions accountable to other people or accountable even to yourself. So accountable to other people, you have the podcast, you have listeners, you don't want to let them down, right? And you don't want to let down potential or future guests. And so you're going to keep going and doing something. And if you all of a sudden stop cycling, but are still doing the podcast, right? Like you could feel maybe a sense of guilt there, but you can also be accountable, not just to kind of your community or individuals in your life, but you can also be accountable to yourself by, setting, you could call them financial penalties. And so there are apps you can download and where essentially you're like, I'm going to reach my goal, whatever it may be, riding this many miles this week, or losing a certain amount of weight. And then if you don't reach that goal, then you had already uploaded some amount of money, and then that amount of money goes to some politician, let's say, that you really don't like. And so you can kind of financially incentivize yourself or hold yourself accountable in order as a way to motivate and get you to stick with what you're trying to do.
That's very interesting. Now, I am familiar with the term gamification, and not to go deep into it, but it's kind of making a game out of something. In my case, I have used Strava, and my wife will testify that it is very important to me to have this data. I know she must get tired of, after every ride, me coming in and breaking it down for her in detail about, where my heart rate was and everything. But it's really motivating for me to see that. And they have different achievements. And so, kind of built within Strava is these different like games. Do you see this as a helpful tool for keeping focus and motivation high?
So it absolutely can be gamification. A lot of fitness or health apps do it. A lot of exercise classes will also do it. They'll have like a leaderboard at the front of like an exercise room. And if people are cycling, it's like who's going the farthest. And, people want to get up there and, win the game. It's also, shown to be really successful with Duolingo, gamifying kind of learning a language. But there's also can be blowback to gamification. And some people really find gamifying certain things to be demotivating, right? If you're somebody that's just getting into cycling and then you go to a class that has like a big leaderboard and then you're never on it for weeks on end, you're like, well, what's the point, right? I'm never going to catch up to these people. And that can demotivate people. There was a study that was looking at salesmen and they had like gamified, as a way to increase sales. And a lot of sales folks were like, no, I'm not interested. And their like actual sales went down because they're like, you took my job, something that I find serious, and you're turning it into some sort of game for what? I feel insulted. I feel demoralized. And so gamification can be extremely effective. It can also have negative effects if applied to the wrong situation or to people that are just not receptive.
That's very interesting. Another thing that has helped me immensely, like last weekend, I went for a ride with my daughter and my son in law. And it seems like my family support has been particularly helpful in keeping me going. How would you characterize the role of family?
So I think family and really community in general. So friends, if you join an organization, like, a cycling club or something like that, can be an integral part of helping people achieve their goals. If your family or your community or whatever group you belong to is supportive of them. If you started cycling again and then your wife and kids were like, Dad, this is terrible. Cycling's so bad. Don't do it. That wouldn't have been right helpful. It might have gotten you to even like stop. But because they were supportive and because you said you were going on a bike ride with your daughter, you're now using this activity, which you wanted to engage in more, as a way of spending time with and bonding with those closest to you. And so you're really kind of layering up the things in your life so that they're all fitting together, which then just reinforces your desired behavior of cycling more.
I really like that layering up concept. My son-in-law early on decided that he would bike with me, which was awesome. And then my daughter later on, just actually recently, said, "Hey, I want to be part of this too." And now we're on a journey to buy my wife a bike. And there will definitely be like family trips taken. I'm sure my wife and I will develop social connections through the podcast. I've developed social connections with people, friendships with people where biking is a major part of their life. When you talk about it can cut the other way, I mean, it, I can really conceive of being part of a community or a family that is really opposed to being active or is really, some of the dietary changes I've made are, reject the dietary changes. I can really see that as going the other way. So I feel pretty thankful that I'm layering up the right direction for sure.
People don't even necessarily have to be actively against whatever behavior you're changing. There could be a passive kind of resistance. So if you started cycling more and more, but then your family and your friends didn't engage in that behavior, now you're just spending more and more time away from them if you want to spend more time with them. And so in a way, then cycling could then be perceived by you or them as kind of getting in the way. There's also kind of the environment around you. Here in Philadelphia, the bike safety is getting better in certain areas of the city, but it's definitely a challenge in others. And so, when you're trying to cycle around the city, there are areas sometimes, I know I don't, and, friends of mine, my wife doesn't go because it's just dangerous, right? There isn't a safe place to bike. And therefore, if we're going to that area of the city, we'll hop on public transportation or some other modes of transport because just the physical environment isn't welcoming to that behavior.
And from a policy perspective, I think that's one of the biggest things is, I'm really interested in how can we affect policy so that safety of pedestrian and bicycle traffic can be a important part. Not everybody is experiencing what it's like to ride in a metropolitan area. So I don't know how you get everybody on board with it, but it's certainly important for those areas where the interaction between cars and bicycles happens all the time.
Absolutely. It's really a big challenge, and something I think about fairly often is how do you break people out of kind of car brain, right? American society has been set up since the end of World War II to revolve around cars. And so when you're talking to policymakers, they might be able to, in the abstract, agree like, of course we should have protected bike lanes or, separate places for cyclists to ride, but actually getting them to break out of this mode that like car convenience has to come first is extremely difficult.
You mentioned community, and one thing about Cascade Bicycle Club, who organizes the Seattle to Portland ride, they do a fantastic job, is that there is this element of community. I just did my first group ride, and it was 21 miles with everybody was my age. People were older than me by a decade. There was this element of being with people that I'm similar, that I can see myself in. If I'm saying that right, that I can see myself being like that at their age, I guess is a good way to put it. And there was this particularly strong incentive when I got online and I registered for the ride and I put my name down there. I'm going to be there. That really pushed me to make sure that I showed up.
The desire for connection, with some community that you identify as your own, which, a natural one is, people around your own age, is large. It's helpful too. If you're trying to do something, if there's, a role model or someone already doing it, because then, in your mind, you can see, right, like this is possible. I'm not being crazy thinking I can do this. There's also a desire not to disappoint or embarrass yourself in front of your peers or your community. And so you're like, hey, I'm going to go do this ride with these people my age. I better make sure I can keep up with them. Human beings are social animals. And so, playing on those evolutionary factors, right, that allowed us as a species to, develop and flourish is, a brilliant way to achieve behavior change.
There's this term that we use called stigma. And there are some elements, when I'm out in Lycra, I'm not the most fit looking person on the planet. And are some elements that are negative when I'm out in public. I wonder if you could talk about this term stigma and what that means.
There's different types, when you're thinking of from a psychological perspective, the word stigma is kind of used in many different kind of categories or in many different ways. But in general, the idea is stigma is an overreaction to kind of true objective risk that something possesses, or an overreaction to what we consider normal. If you're in this context, right, you could feel like, well, in my mind, the typical cyclist, typical person that wears clothes like these has kind of this physique, and I don't. And so you're feeling outside of kind of your comfort zone, right? Because you're not conforming to what you think, right, everyone else is thinking, right? You have this second order thinking of you're like, well, I feel comfortable and I'm a cyclist because, I'm doing all these things, but these people don't think I'm a cyclist. And the stigma could be real. People could be staring at you on the street and being like, what is this guy doing? Or it could be something that you're imagining in your head. Because to you, it maybe feels weird and, you're not fitting the mold of a cyclist.
Seems like an interesting thing because that seems like something that lives on a population level, either in my head, like you said, everybody's looking at me and going, why is that guy dressed this way? Or really that a population starts thinking of things in a certain way. And it seems like the efforts to maybe change those thoughts, that can take some time, that it can be a real effort over time to try to shift the thinking at a population level.
Absolutely. You're not just dealing with what are individuals thinking, and you're not just dealing with what do individuals think others are thinking, but what do individuals think others are thinking that everyone else above that is even thinking, right? Like you have all these different orders of people thinking, and it can be extremely difficult, especially because the individuals at the individual level thinking might have changed, but the way everyone thinks everyone else is thinking might not have. And so that can be a bit of a lag to catch up. That's where in general, it's a good idea. Again, humans are social animals to communicate, right? And to talk and put it into the public forum. What is everyone kind of thinking about this topic? Because then you can kind of take the temperature and see if I've evolved to here, is everyone else still down here like I think, or have they kind of moved up as well?
Very interesting group. They're kind of the tagline of the group is all bodies on bikes. They are really confronting that. And it is an interesting thing where, because of social media, that they are able to get that message out. And then you can see like all the positive comments that they get from different people that they are, I don't know if challenging perception is the right way to say it, but they are not letting perception stop them from getting out and enjoying a ride. And so I do think that, there can be some negative aspects of social media as far as affecting positive change, but they're really demonstrating a positive aspect of social media.
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing new. Like the dynamics that social media kind of plays on or brings out aren't anything new, when it comes to human community. The only difference is it allows, us to kind of engage in those dynamics on a bigger scale. And so when it comes to kind of positive change, right? You're now reaching all these people that, live very far away from you, but are like you in, some characteristic that then allows you to think to yourself, you know what? Yeah, I might be older. I might not be in the best health, but I also can be a cyclist and a serious one, right? But then obviously all the negative kind of social dynamics of people can also then, get supercharged, which, we've seen, in other contexts.
Where do you see the science of understanding how people make change advancing in the next few years? Do you think there's a lot of things to learn? Do you think we're pretty much figuring out? Where do you think we are?
Yeah, I think we're really on the cusp of kind of a new chapter in the study of human behavior. One of the big things that's been most largely elusive is trying to figure out how do we make behavior change stick, right? So there are a lot of different types of interventions or, strategies that have been shown to be very successful in lots of different contexts to, getting people to change their behavior for the good. But a lot of these wear off over time. And so there's the question of, well, how do we really get someone to permanently change their behavior in a positive way, especially for things that you have to, continually do over time? So I think that is kind of that elusive white whale for a lot of researchers is trying to figure that out. I think behavioral phenotyping, trying to figure out, what works for who. And that's really dependent on, do we have the data, right? There's a lot of racial disparities, in the United States, especially with healthcare. And one of the things kind of preventing us from being able to study and really understand is that we don't always have the data needed to be able to analyze what worked. Are there different, racial disparities? And part of that has been like a scale issue as well. And I think this is, more and more research, is going to follow kind of what we're doing here at the Behavior Change for Good initiative, which is let's test these things at scale and see what actually works. And I think the big issues right now, where a lot of these kind of ideas are going to be tested, is in the field of, adaptation to climate change, as well as disinformation, and then, big health issues, such as the, American obesity. Like, how do we get people to lose weight? Are there behavioral interventions that we could be doing that can help people, deal with high blood pressure, help to deal with and prevent COPD? And I also think a big topic where there's a lot of money being poured into it, but nothing's actually being studied in a rigorous scientific way, at least not at scale, would be addiction. We have the opioid epidemic in the United States and, billions of dollars every year being spent to help people deal with addiction. But we still know very little about how to do that. And so I think it's really in these areas that a lot of work will be happening over the next few years. Hopefully progress, but at least work.
Dr. Ellis, thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion. I loved it, and were a whole lot of places that I could have gone down a rabbit hole in the discussion, but I really appreciate your insight, and I appreciate what you guys are doing there. I really feel these kind of efforts to really understand uh, how to affect change are just so valuable when it comes to informing policy decisions and in helping individuals like me who I'm wanting to overcome some of my personal challenges, some of my personal options. So again, thanks so much for taking the time to come on.
Hey, thank you so much for the invitation and for having me on. I really enjoyed the discussion and the opportunity to talk about the research that we're doing here.
Well, thanks, and good luck with your search for a bike.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm hoping to make a purchase soon. The weather's getting nicer.
Yes, nice. All right, take care now.
All right, you too.
Dr. Ellis brought up that Katie Milkman is one of the leaders at the Behavior Change for Good initiative. Dr. Milkman is also the author of a fantastic book titled How to Change. If you're like me and find change to be difficult, you should consider reading the book. Over and over again, as I talked to Dr. Ellis, I was thinking about the community connections that I have made and how valuable they have been in this effort. I have been looking for a way to support more interaction because I think it could provide more value to this community. What I came up with was to launch a Cycling Over 60 Strava group. I don't imagine that everybody is as into Strava data as I am, but I do think a Strava group provides a particular kind of interactivity. I'm not limiting membership in the group to people over 60. I want anybody who is interested in staying on the bike later in life, no matter their age, to feel welcome. I also want to include the people who support older riders. I'm sure there are others out there like my daughter and my son-in-law that play a big role in keeping friends and family cycling. I want them to participate as well. And finally, I want to be able to invite advisors who might be younger to share insights and join in on discussions. I am only beginning to get to know what Strava has to offer a community, and I have a lot to learn. But I do have some ideas that I hope will make the Strava group a really fun place to be. A consequence of inviting everyone is that the club leaderboard will not be the same as if we only had over 60 cyclists. I'm thinking that we can find a way to recognize people of all ages and abilities for their accomplishments. Please let me know if you have some ideas for the group. You can find my email and a link to the show Instagram in the show notes. And of course, now there's also chat on Strava. I would love any feedback you have. I hope this episode helped you think about strategies for making positive changes. Ideally, all your changes will help you to have some fantastic cycling adventures soon. And remember, age is just a gear change.